Delighted to have so many people this morning joining us for this session. Okay, so yeah, I think we've arrived, so it's good. It's good to see you all, or not to see you, unfortunately, but delighted that you've joined us. And hello and a big welcome. So this is the Council-led Housing Forum. And this is the first time that we've done this forum through a webinar. It's a new format, and obviously we're quite dependent on our internet connections. Our internet drops, and we have to quickly get ourselves back up on the air. But we'll do that as quickly as we can, and I hope that your IT at your end as well will be working well. So the Council-led Housing Forum was set up to provide support for boroughs who are doing direct delivery of new council homes, and that can either be direct or through companies or through ALMOs. And our sessions are aimed at practitioners. So in particular, today's session, we are aiming very much for those who are new into development, either because you've recently joined a direct delivery team at London Borough, or because you're in a support function. So that's the aim of today, is to help you with this first phase, the initial analysis and feasibility. And this is the first in a mini-series that will take us from the start of the process through to the end. So my name is Feasibility and I'm the Council-led Housing Forum Manager for Future of London. Future of London, if you're not familiar with us, we're a network for the built environment. We were set up by the London boroughs, and we provide knowledge, leadership and networking. And none of what we would do would be possible without our sponsors. I want to give them a shout out now. That's the GLA, Red Loft, Potter Aper and BPTW, and you'll be meeting some of them later. So to our agenda, this is where we are currently. We're in the introduction, and I will be doing a little bit of housekeeping just to help you with the screen and to let you know how we're using the various excuse me, various functions in this Zoom. We have our main presentation. So this is very much an agenda of two parts: main presentation on the initial analysis and feasibility. We'll then have a break. That's really your chance to get a cup of tea, have a stretch, and then come back and join us very promptly for our second presenter for the case study. And that will then be followed by a Q&A session. So just move on now and let's have a look at the housekeeping. So this is the general housekeeping for you to know. First half of the webinar is being recorded. So that means that you'll be able to watch it again. And also we will send you out the presentation. So you don't need to take a note of everything that you see on the screen. You will get a copy of that. And as I say, you will be able to watch the first presentation again. You can submit questions and answers at any point during this session by using the Q&A, and we'll have a look at that function in a minute. And if you lose connection, just re-click the link that we sent you and you should be able to rejoin us. But hopefully not too many internet problems this morning. Finally, I just want to mention when we leave at the end of the webinar, you will have the option to do a feedback form, and we'd really appreciate you giving us some feedback, especially as this is our first session doing doing it as a webinar. So here we are, the screen. This is how your screen hopefully looks. Just going to point out at the top of the screen you have sort of view options, and there's a drop down menu to view it side by side so that it looks a bit like the picture you can see. And you also have a bar, it's a little bit hidden between the presentation and the pictures of the speakers. So you can use that bar if you want to either make the speakers section wider or to make the presentation section wider. So whatever suits you, you can set that up. Now, you may be seeing myself, and you may be seeing that we have a number of our presenters and panelists, but you're probably only seeing their name or their icon. So one of the things you can do to make it a much better view is to choose to hide non-video participants. You don't have to, but you might find it makes it a better experience. And you can do that simply by clicking on one of the videos and getting the drop-down box that you see on the right-hand side with that option. So hide non-video participants. Important function that I hope you'll all be able to use is the Q&A. So just pointing out here, the Q&A function is at the bottom of the screen, and you can use this throughout the session. So we will come to the questions in the final part. And just to say as well, so the final part, we're aiming to end just before 11 o'clock. As I'm sure you're aware, there's a minute's silence at 11 o'clock for the NHS workers that have died. And we want to make sure that we finish just before that. So if we don't get a chance to get to your question, what we will do is put some written answers out later that we can share with you, and will hopefully be helpful. So finally, we're going to give you a chance immediately to engage with us, and we're going to do this using the poll function. So in a moment, you're going to see a poll, and it looks a bit like what you're seeing on the screen now. So I think what we'll do is we'll open up the poll. The questions are fairly straightforward, but you know, they never quite fit. So I'm just going to ask you to give the answer that's closest for you. And yeah, it's just to give us a feel for where you are and what you're involved with. Let me launch it, and hopefully it will make sense. Okay, I'm just about to launch. So here goes. You should be able to see our questions. Okay, I can see that we have got answers coming in. Hopefully you can see those poll questions. Yes, the questions are coming in. I think we're nearly there. Okay, I'm going to give you a little bit more time. What we'll be doing is coming back to these later on during the presentations. Okay. Still some more voting coming in. We're around about 70% at the moment, so I want to give those of you that are still, yeah, oh, we're really gathering a pace now. 80% of you have had a chance now. I'm just gonna give us a little bit more time. your best fit answer. We appreciate that there might not be the exact answer there for what you're doing, and lots of you will be working on multiple schemes. Perhaps you're just thinking about the main scheme that you're working on now in relation to these ones. Okay, I think we've probably got most of your votes in now. So thank you very much. We'll come back to those answers during the presentation, and I am going to close this down in the next 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Okay, so we've closed the poll down. As I say, we'll come back to that. Thank you very much for your participation. And this leads us into our first presentation. So I'd like to welcome our first speaker, who is Danny Kay. So Danny is Managing Director of Sheridan Development Management Limited, and has worked with Future of London on a number of our projects. Welcome, Danny.
Hello.
Hello, Danny.
Hello, hi.
So, welcome.
Yeah.
Morning. We are going to move on now to your first presentation, and I'm going to pass straight over to you.
Thank you. Okay. Good morning, everybody. This is the first of 4 sessions under the Development Management Programme for Future of London Programme 2. So good morning. Hope this is useful and hope you enjoy it. So this picture, this represents your destination. This is a typical example of a council-led 100% affordable housing scheme. And it's an example. Some schemes may be lower density, some schemes may be bigger, some schemes may be higher density, some may be houses, some may be 10 stories, some may be 5 stories or 4 stories, and all of that will have different knock-on effects in terms of the overall delivery and viability of your project. Almost certainly, your council-led housing programs are going to be largely, if not in their entirety, affordable housing. Some of you, through housing companies, may actually be undertaking some mixed tenure homes, but that's probably a minority, but let's see what happens in the poll results. I'm not going to go into detail about COVID-19. No doubt all of you are really sort of focusing on all the challenges and problems in the current time. But I think what it does emphasize is the real importance of affordable housing programs through local authorities, through councils, and through housing associations and others. And actually, more than ever, the counter-cyclical nature of affordable housing is so very, very important. Next slide, please. So, development management, what is it? Well, it's more than project management. Not that there's anything wrong with project management, but actually, to all intents and purposes, as a development manager, you are a developer. The tenures might be different. The margins, the financial margins, the financial targets might be different. In fact, they are different. But actually, the principles are the same. Your role is not just internal, as an internal coordinator, guardian of the project, but also external. So it's an internal and external role, and your role is to chase up hard, to coordinate everything, to be the guardian of design, guardian of the budget, guardian of the program, guardian of the financial performance, guardian of sales, and more importantly, if it's in terms of affordable housing, rented housing, guardian of letting, and making sure that you liaise well with all other departments. Next slide, please. So what is your development strategy as an organisation? Are you developing through your housing revenue account? Are you developing through a housing company? Do you have a subsidiary registered provider? What's your defined strategy? Now, in 2018, the Mayor of London's Council Homes for Londoners programme amounted to almost or just over £1 billion worth of grant for 27 different local authorities, delivering a programme of 100% affordable rented, or London affordable rented housing for almost 15,000 homes. What does this mean for you in terms of your programme, in terms of your target mix? 1 beds, 2 beds, 3 beds, houses, flats, maisonettes, the tenure, London affordable rent, social rent, intermediate rent, a proportion of affordable rent. Do you have a dedicated team? Does the team sit within the local authority? Does this team sit within an arm's length management organisation? Our team responsibility is split between housing client and capital programme, which is responsible for delivery. And the different programmes of different local authorities will be different because they reflect different geographies. They reflect different densities from inner urban London through to the suburban of outer London. The business plans will be different of your respective housing revenue accounts. The housing revenue account isn't just about development, it's also about maintenance, housing management, asset management of the housing stock and portfolio. So all of these things will shape your programme differently. Next slide, please. So let's assume that a large element of your programmes is via the housing revenue account. So how will it be funded? Well, the housing revenue account, effectively, for all intents and purposes, borrows money. So if a project costs 10 million, a proportion of that 10 million will be borrowed from and via the housing revenue account, and another proportion of it will be paid for by capital grant. Now that capital grant could be by way of, as I've already mentioned, money from the GLA, from the Greater London Authority, or if it's outside of London, from Homes England. Or you could be leveraging up to certain rules and percentages, recycled right to buy receipts. Again, this is quite a common programme. There are rules associated with that, one of them being that you could only apply 30% of right to buy receipts to 30% of the costs. Again, I've mentioned about what's the development investment entity. It might be that you have a housing company. For example, in Croydon, there is Brick by Brick, and Brick by Brick is a delivery partner and a delivery vehicle for affordable housing for Croydon. Not just, as I understand it, for affordable housing, you've also got an HRA programme. Is it all affordable rent? What is affordable rent? Well, affordable rent is proportions of rent up to 80% of market rent. But many local authorities, in fact, many housing associations don't regard that as affordable. So there are different proportions of rent. One of the key levels of rent in London, and as published by benchmarks through the Greater London Authority, is London affordable rent. That's probably the closest we can get to social rent. Do you have a target tenure mix? These are all important questions because they affect the financial business performance that's set out by your in your corporate strategy, but also probably by your finance teams in partnership with other members of the management team. That's absolutely appropriate to have financial targets and hurdles. Every business, most businesses do have financial targets and hurdles. For example, what's the target turnover? What's the target profit? You're just applying it to a different kind of business plan and a different kind of project. Next slide, please. So the chances are that actually there has already been a capacity study that's been undertaken by your teams previously, or by colleagues previously, or by different departments previously. There's probably an awful lot of information that already exists, that's already been undertaken, that identifies perhaps 30, 40, 50 sites. And those studies will have said, these are the sites which actually we think as an organisation have the possibility of for redevelopment or infill development. Of course, largely for today, we're focusing on infill development and low-scale redevelopment. What I mean by low-scale redevelopment is redevelopment of garages, perhaps some existing housing, small-scale, low-scale housing blocks that have already been vacated, but not whole-scale regeneration. Again, that will be a subject of another Future of London session, I'm sure. So these capacity studies are really useful. They could have been undertaken externally by one of the firms of architects that you probably already work with, and they identify the potential. They could, and more often than not, they do say, all other things being equal, on this specific site, you could get between 20 and 30 homes, or 50 to 60 homes, or 100 homes, and so on and so forth. But you need to get hold of that information because it's very useful information. Now, the one thing I would say is be careful about pressing the button on doing too much detailed design at an early stage, because your site, you may have been given a portfolio of 10 sites, 5 sites. Your site is heavily influenced by what's in the site and what's around the site. There are many things that you can glean and learn from the site by going there yourself and noting things down. Get a pad, a pen, draw pictures, draw lines, think in 3-dimension, go to that site and list things down. And speak to colleagues who've got information. Should you commission an initial design study? Maybe, maybe not. Should you undertake a very simple development appraisal? Yes, you should. And that could be, what if I could do 30 homes, 10 1-beds, 10 2-beds, 10 3-beds. I know what the floor areas are, or they may have template floor areas in the appraisal model itself. And I'm going to be charging affordable rent, and I'm going to get a grant of 70k a unit. Does it work? Very crudely, can it work on the simple development appraisal? So just going to carry on this stage one. Stage one is about gathering information, understanding, learning, thinking in 3-dimension. Next slide, please. So the importance of a site visit. What does this tell us? It tells us that there are trees, as evidently there are trees, but what does that mean? Do those trees have a tree preservation order? Do they have root lines, canopy lines, which potentially affect the position of a building, the position of foundations? Does this grass verge represent potentially adopted highway that may need to be de-adopted? Next slide, please. Garages. These garages, this is the site. The garages will need to be knocked down, but it's probably likely, looking at the age of these garages, looking at the roofs, that there's asbestos in them. Asbestos has certain requirements and provisions and rules associated with demolition, which actually marginally increase the cost of demolition. There's a lamppost nearby. What impact might that lamppost have in terms of the position of electrical wires and conduits feeding that lamppost? Can you build above them? Will there need to be electrical diversions? There's housing nearby with windows. Will their daylight and sunlight be affected through the planning process? And in property law, will the rights of light be affected? Next slide, please. So, what can we learn from this side? Well, if we look at the fence line, there's an inner fence, probably not easily seeable from this picture, but actually, in fact, in this specific project, there was a right-of-way running across the boundary where you couldn't build anything. So again, that affects the position of your building. Again, there's demolition of an existing building here. And another point, this is in terms of temporary management of a site, is making sure that the site is secure. As you can see, there's fly tipping. What does that lead to? Vermin. What does that lead to? Complaints. And what does that lead to? A letter from a councillor. And what does that lead to? Time you have to spend responding to a letter from a councillor, and time you have to spend liaising with another team in order to clear up the site. Time which is all about development management coordination. It's not just about liaison with the architect, the development appraisal. There's so many aspects of coordination. Next slide, please. So what can this slide tell us? Well, there's 3 manholes there, potentially suggesting that might be the line of a sewer run. If that's the line of a sewer run, how deep is that sewer? How wide is that sewer? would it make sense in any way possible to actually divert that sewer? If not, because the cost of that would be very, very high, then you're going to be building around that sewer run. Next slide, please. Again, if we look at the main road here, there's a bus laid by a bus stop. But actually that bus stop may coincide with the right entrance into the site. So in fact, if you're designing from an architect's perspective and a transport perspective, you need to think, well, actually, can I really put an entrance into the site at this position? Because there's a bus laid right there. Very simple, but actually these are the things you need to take into account. Next slide, please. What can I learn from what's happening in the adjacent area? Well, in fact, there's a new build scheme here. It's three and a half, 4 stories. Actually, does that set a precedent in planning terms, in terms of bulk, mass, design, style, materials? Again, something to be learned, some research to be done from the planning application and the planning history for this scheme. Next slide, please. And finally, again, an example of trees, access into a site, a main road. What's the situation in terms of parking? The lamppost, does that mean that there's going to be electrical cables running to and from? Position of adjacent properties, impact on daylight and sunlight. Again, the importance of thinking in 3-dimension. Next slide, please. So you have done your appraisal. It looks all right. Your net present value is meeting its target performance. Your payback year is looking okay. You have a justification now for moving from that very, very initial stage through to the next stage. But this next stage, you've got to think in terms of risk management. What does this mean in terms of how much budget you should spend? You are the guardian of the council's money in terms of risk. Should you be just pressing now to a planning application and that will cost you £300,000, £400,000, depending on the size of scheme? Or should you actually do an interim stage and think, okay, right, the outline case kind of works. What more can I do in terms of desktop studies in order to determine whether and how the project should move forwards? For a scheme of maybe 30 homes, you could be looking at a desktop budget for desktop studies and further investigations, and including an outline architectural design study of say £25,000. Stage 1, you might be spending £5,000. Stage 2, this is this stage, £25,000 on desktop studies, a design study. Stage 3, and there's a huge shift here, which we'll come on to in a minute, is potentially hundreds of thousands of pounds. So think about the risk profile, the staging and structuring of the outlay. So your appraisal's looking okay. I just think it's really important to emphasize, in order to help you understand what desktop studies need to be undertaken, you should speak to colleagues. You should understand what other people have been doing. You could pick up the phone to your friend in another local authority and say, I've got this site, looks like we need to do a desktop study on contamination and so on. How did you address these problems? Speaking to others is good. And I would really think it's important to emphasize the role of your employer's agent here. If you can involve your employer's agent early, the employer's agent will have a view and an idea about how this could affect costs and what due diligence investigations you really ought to do at this stage, on the desktop stage. Next slide, please. So these are the kind of things that would be involved in the desktop report. This should be enough to steer and shape your strategy, to determine whether the project can work and also what happens thereafter. Title report's important. Actually, more often than not, there are problems with legal title. Problems could be rights of way. there could be a historic covenant which says you can't build anything on the site other than, for example, industrial premises, for example. Possibly unlikely, but these things do occur. What property market analysis can you do and should you do in terms of rent levels, in terms of property values, especially important if you've got a mixed tenure scheme? Desktop services report, very important. I highlighted earlier the importance of understanding as best you can at different stages the position of services and the impact on the scheme. History of the site in terms of contamination, what's happening in planning policy, desktop and archaeological studies, unexploded bombs. Go back to World War II, there are thousands of unexploded bombs, particularly in the east of London. So couple that history. What ecological information might there be? In those trees and the pictures, the photos you saw earlier, could some of those trees, or could some of the buildings that exist that are vacant, might they be homes for bats or other species? And if so, there are strict rules about how you manage the relocation of certain species. And again, an initial design study to help steer and shape. Next slide, please. So you've got all these reports back. They're sitting in a pile on your desk. Oh, no, sorry, that's wrong. I shouldn't say that. They're actually sitting in your inbox. We should be paperless, of course. And you're going through all these reports. What did they say? What does your employer's agent think about them? What does it mean for the scale of development? Is it 3 stories, 4 stories? What does this mean for your tenure mix, for a unit mix? Is it possible to get houses on the site? Is the ideal brief of a third of 1 beds, 2 beds, 3 beds, is that possible? Is it mean your construction is going to be within a range or completely outside of a range? If it's outside of a range, the scheme might not stack up. That does happen. So there are lots of issues. You need to then financially reappraise the site, sense check it, speak to others, speak to your managers. Have you got enough there? Does it work in order to move to the next stage, to press that button of investment from 25,000, 30,000 pounds through to 300, 400,000 pounds? Some sites might not work. Some sites will need a different way of thinking in terms of unit mix, or a different approach, or certainly taking account of different types of complexities. So I'm just going to pause there. Jessica, what are the results of polls 1 and 2?
Okay, thanks, Danny. Just going to get those up on screen, and while I'm doing that, actually, we have had a couple of questions come in, and could I ask, if when you're writing your question, if you could just put down who you work for, that would be really useful, so we know. And if there's a particular as we go through the session, if there's a particular person you want to address the question to, you can also add that in as well. Okay, got the poll up on screen now. So the first 2 questions. The first question was, what is the average size of your schemes? Just really give us a feel about the schemes that people who've joined us this morning are dealing with. And quite interesting, it's quite an even split. So most of you are dealing with schemes that are 61 plus, so the larger size schemes. We didn't, that could be very large. Maybe you're doing a 500 plus scheme. But we do have a substantial number of people who are doing schemes in 0 to 20, that's about 30%. A smaller number of you at 21 to 40, and smaller still at 41 to 60. So larger schemes, but small schemes are still not insubstantial, and I think a lot of people will start building their career on smaller schemes. What is the average height of your schemes was our second question. So this question is definitely 2 to 4 stories. Over half of our audience, that's the kind of scheme that you're working on, followed by 5 to 7, and that's about 30%. And of the remainder, about 11% are on 8 to 10, and only a few of you are doing 11 stories and above. So just 7% of the audience. So the majority are on those schemes of 2 to 4.
Well, that's really interesting. Thank you very much for that. That's the number of 0 to 20 was expected, but I have to say I was rather anticipating more in the 21 to 40 range and the 41 to 60 range. So that tells you something in terms of size of scheme and in terms of development strategy. And that's a good thing, because actually you're delivering potentially at scale for each and every site. That's a potentially risky thing from a development strategy perspective, because in fact you've got more eggs, as it were, in one basket. And if there's a problem with that scheme, a lot of your program proportionally is wrapped up in that one scheme. So what cover do you have in terms of your program for other sites that may come through if that gets delayed? In height, this is a very interesting one, 2 to 4 stories, 50% of the projects. So that's suggesting low to medium density, which has a knock-on effect in terms of construction costs. I'm sure the members of the panel will want to mention more about that later, or if they can, in terms of the knock-on effect in terms of construction costs. But I'm sure you know, but just to reiterate, the higher you get, marginally, the more costly it gets. And when you get to certain thresholds, 10 stories, 11 stories and above, suddenly there's a significant shift in construction cost to do with associated with the additional requirements for structural integrity, foundations and so on and so forth. So these are very interesting. So I'm going to move on, but before I do, I just want to say one thing, which is linked to what I just said earlier about the overall development strategy, but actually it's the portfolio approach. So many housing organisations, housing associations, all of them in fact, will probably have targets to say in their business plan that a project's financial performance has to be A, B, C, D, E. That might be net present value, a positive net present value over a 40-year period, a payback year within 25 years or 30 years, an internal rate of return of say 4.5%, and so on and so forth. But actually, some organisations with schemes that are on the cusp but may not quite cut the mustard in terms of financial performance may still proceed with those schemes, because actually they have a bigger strategic benefit and contribution in terms of the number of homes they're delivering. So I just want you to think about this concept of a portfolio approach. Some schemes may be better than the target financial performance. Some schemes may be worse than the financial performance, but actually it's looking at the wider benefits as well in order to make decisions. Again, you can't have a whole portfolio that actually fails the financial performance, then really damages the business plan. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but these are the typical headings that you're going to have in your business plan, in your report on your project, and they're very straightforward, they're very self-explanatory. This is what you need to do in terms of getting your approval to that 300,000, the 400,000, 500,000 pounds that you're going to need to commit to move through this next stage, this really detailed stage of working up a planning application, of actually working out how the scheme will work itself in terms of design, structure, performance. Does it meet the design requirements if you have a specific design brief and employs requirements and so on? So this is fairly self-explanatory and actually links very much to the headings of your development strategy: why, what, where, when, how, who, and so on. Next slide, please. So will be your typical professional team for your project from this stage onwards. You definitely have an architect, You'll almost certainly have a landscape architect for much bigger projects, especially structural engineer, services engineer, sustainability, soils, intrusive investigation for contamination and soil quality. Does the soil quality require a certain kind of foundation? You're definitely going to need to do a topographical and site survey. What are the level differences on the site, and how do they need to be taken into account in terms of cost, design, stepping, and so on? And the rest of this is relatively self-explanatory. Now, we do have, we'll be able to circulate, I'm sure, a checklist with materials, whether it's this week or next week or subsequently, but a checklist that you can refer to help sort of tick the box or question and challenge yourself about whether and what kind of areas of work you need to do. And again, speak to your employer's agent as well. One missing from this is the possible involvement of a contractor at an early stage process. Now, I think that's a really good thing, because I think you have an early involvement through that planning and design process of whether thing is buildable. But there are problems and challenges sometimes associated with that in terms of the procurement process. I'm not going to dwell on that now. So let's move on to the next slide. Financial appraisal, budgeting and efficiency tips. So we're moving towards the end of the presentation. But I think one thing to remember is in your financial appraisal and how you do things, you need to think about two key stages of the process in your appraisal in terms of the life of the project. Stage one is your development cash flow. How much money is going out, for how long, and for what? How much is this going to be? How much will this cost from start to finish? Let's say it's £10 million. Your development cash flow, your development period, start to finish. Your operating cash flow is the life of the building once it's finished. And these are two distinct, important and interrelated aspects. Your development cash flow is the money you're spending and the grants that will contribute towards this. That the operating cash flow is all the income minus management and maintenance costs, operating costs, that is used to pay for the borrowing of the balance of the capital costs and the repayment of debt. Consultants and technical costs during the development stage can vary between 10 to 20%, depending on the size of the scheme, of course. And I would have thought, from what you have said, in terms of your average size of scheme, in terms of height, and in terms of the likelihood of where you're at with grant and rent levels, probably at London affordable rent for a large proportion of the schemes, your range of construction would need to be within 2,250 a metre squared on gross internal area to £3,000. Others will fall outside that, but I would have thought that'd be your range. Some sites will have more requirements for infrastructure, which will push it outside the range. I've mentioned about operating costs on the long-term cash flow. Other ratios and other important tips. What's your net to gross ratio? Typically, many private developers would target a net to gross ratio of 80%. These days, 80% is actually quite challenging when you take into account all floors of a building. So a ground floor will almost certainly have the worst net to gross ratio. What do we mean by that net to gross ratio? Well, what is the net represents your sellable or lettable area. The gross is the total area of construction of the building. And you know, in mathematical terms, if you've got an 80% net to gross ratio, is the value and cost ratio and the financial performance is going to be that much better. So the net to gross ratio is going to be important, but typically I would have thought you'd be looking at, when you take into account ground floors, something of the rate, you know, in the order of about 75% net to gross ratio. But again, that's an interesting discussion point. The other net to gross ratio to think about is how much money is going out of the door, and it needs to go out of the door for successful management, maintenance, responsive maintenance, planned maintenance, voids, bad debts, future major repairs, service charges over the life of the scheme. And again, this can range from 20%, depending on the size of the scheme, to 40% plus. And that's really important, because effectively that is income that you're not getting because you're having to do your job as a landlord, do a good job, the right job as a landlord, protecting the future integrity of the building, providing a customer service. And the less income you have, the less it can pay for the long-term debt. So again, there's a dynamic here. Water flow ratio, I won't dwell on that. That's another ratio that cost consultants use in terms of looking at efficiency. Next slide, please. These are the typical financial performance targets that you'll be looking at, almost certainly, and hopefully you will all have a financial appraisal model, which is a way of determining whether your project is financially performs according to your business plan. Typically, a payback year could be between 30 and 40 years. Another ratio here is total scheme costs as a percentage of open market value. Now, if that's 125%, so your total scheme cost is significantly more than market value, that may not be a problem in itself, but it will tell you something that actually this is probably not going to perform and meet your financial parameters. So again, these are useful benchmarks and ratios. Total scheme cost per unit, total scheme cost per meter squared. Some organizations, housing associations and local authorities have a defined target, so that a total scheme cost per unit should be no more than, say, £2,750 per metre squared on the gross internal area. Sorry, rather construction cost, or total scheme cost of £3,000 per metre squared. So again, these are important ratios. We really don't have time today to actually dwell on these. I'm sure there'll be another opportunity as a later session to actually explain this in more detail. Next slide, please. So this is a typical scheme of 30 homes, all at London affordable rent, £7.5 million build cost, grant at £70,000 a unit. This is just to give you a sense of the risk profile, the staging of risk, and the structuring, the importance of structuring in terms of what this means for outlay and money, and being the guardian of budgets at each and every stage, and how different they are in terms of how much you have to commit at each stage. Just to recap, stage one, maybe that's £10,000 of initial investigations. Stage two, lots of desktop studies and a more detailed architectural design study, could be 25,000 plus. But then when you move into the stage three, and again, that interestingly marries up with the RIBA, the Royal Institute of British Architects staging, could be looking at hundreds of thousands of pounds. So this is this cumulative cost, this risk you need to keep thinking about in terms of what this means. And then finally, last slide, a structured approach is important. It will vary. There will be chances to actually go, or that you may be required to be a little bit more adaptable, a little bit more pragmatic. Be careful not to rush into overly commissioning design work. Be a guardian of financial performance. Speak to your employer's agent and others and colleagues about the extent of due diligence and investigation you need to do at each stage. Be careful about selecting a professional team. There'll be rules and procurement rules about doing that. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Step back. Remember the end goal. Remember, you're the guardian of time, quality, and budget. And that at each stage, the £5,000, the £25,000 is money well spent to have a focused, diligent, cogent risk approach to development managing and being the developer of your sites. So before we finish, just look at, just want to find out what's happening with poll questions 3 and 4. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Danny. The third question we asked our audience was, what are the majority of your schemes in terms of social tenure? So this well over, yeah, 54%, yeah. The biggest chunk is mixed tenure. So our audience are working on mixed tenure schemes predominantly, followed by social rent, that was 21%, and then different levels of affordable rent, and the smallest percentage was actually, for our audience, London affordable rent, that was 11%.
That's really interesting. Thank you for that. Well,
And can I just give you
yeah,
the other one, actually, whilst I've got them up on the screen? So the fourth question was, how are the majority of your new build schemes on local authority owned land delivered? So how are we delivering? And we've actually got a question I can see from one of our participants. So interesting, 64% housing revenue account,
yeah.
11% housing company, 14% said through a registered provider, so housing association, and a further 11% talked about partnership. So partnership could be with a housing association as well, but it could be with a private sector partner.
That's really interesting. So I think the 64% HRA is probably to be expected. The 54% mixed tenure is probably higher, perhaps, than maybe the average. And that's a really interesting point, because if it's mixed tenure, you're more exposed to the market. And actually, in this time when it's entirely possible that property prices are going to go down for a period of time, that includes rents, that includes sales values, and that will affect shared ownership and intermediate rent and proportions of affordable rent. This is a time to really sense check whether your appraisal is still working or can withstand a drop in values, and how will that affect your overall program, your development strategy, and the business plan. Really interesting, important points. So thank you very much. I hope that was interesting and helpful, and Jessica, over to you.